Hi, I'm Wanda from Alanda Craft, and today we're going to be making this really cute baby quilt, or it could be a lap quilt. It's been made with charm squares, and this one here has been professionally quilted. However, today I'm going to be making this one, also with a charm square pack, but I've simply done some straight line sewing on it to quilt it. So let's get on and show you how to make it. So what you're going to need is a charm pack. Now this one here that I'm going to use is one I've had on hand for a while, but it's Best Day Ever by April Rosenthal for Moda, and it's quite a pretty bright one, so we'll be using that. But you can also cut your own 5-inch squares from fabric you have on hand, and we have a tutorial on that, and I'll put a link in the description below. Now you're also going to need some strips of fabric for your borders, and you'll need 4 strips at 2.5 inches, and you'll need 4 strips at 4 inches, and these are cut across the width of the fabric. Now you'll also need some fabric for your backing, and you'll also need some batting. Now all the measurements are going to be on the website, so make sure you go over there to check what you need before you go on. So now it's time to lay out the squares and decide how I want them, so I mix them up until I get that look that I'm looking for, and I lay them down in rows of 6 by 7, so they're 6 across by 7 down. Now once I've taken a photo, it helps when I'm putting these together in case I get something out of alignment. I can just refer back to the photo. So then we come to sewing them together. Now what I do is I do them a row by row. So I take the first 2 squares, lay them one on top of the other, and I'm just going to sew down here with a 1/4 inch seam, and then I'll do exactly the same with the next 2 squares and the next 2. And then once those are sewn together into groups of 2, I'll just come back and sew them all together into one long row. And I'm going to do that, I'll work my way down each of these rows. So I've sewn all my squares into rows, and now what you want to do is you want to press the seams. Now with the top row, you'll press them all in one direction, and you can see here I've pressed them all that way. Now on the second row, you want them to go in the opposite direction. Okay, so you can see here, these are pressed in the opposite direction to the first row. The next row, again, comes back the other way. So you're going to do that all the way down your rows.
Okay, it's Paula here, and as you can see, Wanda has finished sewing the rows together, and what we need to do now is actually attach all the rows together to form the top of the quilt. And I'm just here to actually show you how I pin these. So we do them in lots of 2, so we always take 2 rows, and then we put one over the top of the other, like that. And then we start pinning these together. Now we need to do this right, otherwise what happens is your seams don't line up and it looks a bit odd. So you don't want seams coming out here, you want them nicely lined up. So what I do is I start in the middle, grab this one and just make sure it's kind of lined up there, and then I pop it over there, and then because you can see we've pressed in one direction on the bottom row and this direction in the top, they nest nicely together. But the way to check is just to, what I do is sort of run my fingers together like that, and if it forms a lump, you know you're not doing it right, but eventually it'll just sort of flatten out perfectly. And then I grab a pin and I pop that pin and pop it in there, and then I'll move on to the next one. So again, come in here and again just basically line them up, but then I just sort of run my fingers together like that to make sure they're joined up, or nested I should say, not joined up. And again, do that, and you can notice I'm pinning downwards. I just find that seems to work better. Come back up to this one. Okay, and then once I've done that, I will do the ends. So I grab one end, just make sure it's not lined up nicely. And this way I do the pins in this direction now. So I do one there, same with the other end. And then lastly, I just pin across these sections here. So I grab a pin there. And this might be a bit overkill, but it seems to work, and it seems to make the seams line up really well. Okay, all done. So we're ready to sew those together, and we'll do that with the next 2 as well. We'll do exactly the same thing, so do it all in lots of 2. And because this is a 7 by 6 quilt, you're actually going to end up with another row at the end, an extra row, but that can be sewed on to the last lot of 2.
Okay, so now we have our rows sewn in lots of 2. So now we take these 2 rows and we're going to lay them over top of the next 2 rows, and we'll sew those together along there with a 1/4 inch seam, and then we'll take the 4 rows and sew them onto the last lot of rows, and that'll be all sewn together. Now if you've done a good job of sewing this together with a 1/4 inch seam, what you'll end up with is your centrepiece here, which will measure 32 inches by 27.5 inches. So once you've got that, it's time to add the borders. So I have my borders cut, and the first ones we're going to add are the long border pieces, and what I do is I'm just going to lay this along here on one edge, and I'll do the same on the other. So add along there, and then I'm going to pin. So how I pin my borders is I take one end and match the edges up, and I'll just pop a pin in there, and then I come to the other end and I do exactly the same thing. Just pin it there, and then on a small quilt like this you can just give it a bit of a tug and come to the middle, and this sort of makes the edge, the amounts that you have here, fairly even. Okay, and then I pop one in the middle. Alright, and then I'll finish pinning along here, and I'll do the same on the other side. And then what I'll do is I'll just sew along here with a 1/4 inch seam, do the same on the other edge, and then we'll be ready to add the other borders. Okay, so I've sewn on the long strips, and now it's time to do the short ends. So as you can see here, I have my piece of border, and I'm going to just lay it over the top, and I'll sew along there with a 1/4 inch seam, and that'll match up nicely, and I'll do exactly the same on the other end. So now it's time to add the outside border, and I've got my border piece here, and again I'm just going to lay the right sides together, pin it down, and sew it with a 1/4 inch seam all the way down, and I'll do that on both sides. So I'll go and do that now. Okay, so I've done the 2 sides, and now I'm going to do the top and bottom. So again I take my piece of border and lay it right sides together, and don't forget to pin at either end first, and then just give it a tug, pin in the middle, and then pin all the way along. So, and then I'm going to sew it with a 1/4 inch seam on this end, and then I'll do the same at the other end. So I've created my quilt sandwich, and I've done this using a 505 temporary adhesive spray. This is great, this stuff, and also some quilting pins, and I've used the curved quilting pins. And what I did is I laid the backing down on the floor, face down, then I've added my batting, and then I've laid the top on face up, and then pinned it all down. Now if you're having this professionally quilted, you need to talk to your long arm quilter to see how much extra batting and backing she needs to use her machine. We're only going to be doing a simple quilting on this, so I've allowed about 2.5 to 3 inches all the way around. So now we'll go and quilt it. Okay, I thought you might like to just see what I'm doing here. I've got my walking foot on, and I'm running the 1/4 inch line on that walking foot down the seam line, and I'm doing a 1/4 inch out from on either side from the seam line. You can see that here where I've actually finished this one, and it causes that little square in the middle there. But I'm starting and finishing with a back stitch simply because I don't want to go back and tie off all the knots. If you want to do that, that's up to you. But anyway, so as you can see, I've got this line here, which is the 1/4 inch line, along the seam line, and put my needle in position. I'll just do a couple of small stitches back, and away we go. Now it's just like when you're ditch stitching. Pull your seam out a little bit and keep things flat, so that nothing bunches up on you. And just take your time. You don't have to rush this. And if your seams have been sewn nice and straight where they join, then you'll have no trouble. You just continue on down the seam line for the next set of squares. Okay, so I just slow down as I get to the bottom because I don't want to sew into the border, and just keep an eye on where my needle is going, and then just back stitch. Okay, so now I'll turn it round and come up the other side, and then we'll end up with that look there on all of these seams. So there you go. You can see here that I've stitched on either side 1/4 inch from the seam line all along each of the lines, and then I've done a ditch stitch, which means sewing into the seam line around here, starting and ending with the back stitch, and I've gone all the way around. And the same here, I've just done a stitch in the ditch, and again starting and ending with the back stitch. So now it's time to trim our quilt, and I've put my mat long ways. It gives me a longer area for cutting. Now my border is quite straight. I can see that just looking at it. But what I'll do is I bring my ruler over, and I've got it at the 3 3/4 mark, and that seems to take in all of the border nicely, and I don't have anything, any of the bits sort of wobbling in. And I'm also going to just make sure at the same time that this border is the same, and yes, 3 3/4 is going to cover that border as well. Now, if you have a little bit of batting showing, so you've got a bit of a wobble in your border, that's okay because it's going to get taken up in the binding. But if you have places where there's a lot of batting showing, then you just need to move your ruler back. You'll have a smaller border, but you do need to trim it in that case. But as it is, I'm just going to go with 3 3/4, and I've got my ruler lined up nicely on that seam line, and then I'll cut. Okay, as I cut, I just move the quilt up. And there we have it. Our quilt is trimmed, and now we just need to bind it. So there we are. All we need to do now is add the binding. Now we have a tutorial on how to bind a quilt, and I'll put a link in the description below. Now if you've enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. You can also catch us over on Pinterest, Facebook, and on our website, alendracraft.com.